You know, 150 years ago, if you wanted to know how the heart circulated, you literally, and this was an experiment that was done in France, you literally strapped a living horse to a board, cut him open, and watched how his heart pumped. So on some level, one would have to say that at that point in the history of science, animal use, even at its most abusive, may have been a necessary tool. But now what we know is that it's a limited tool. So I'm Dr. Theodora Capaldo. I'm a licensed psychologist by training, but right now I'm the president and executive director of the England Anti-Vivisection Society, otherwise known as NEVS. Our approach is to always take on the humane ethical concerns of our founders, but we're very lucky in 2015 to be able to sort of juxtapose our humane ethical concerns on top of a very solid scientific reason why ending animal testing is what's going to happen. Any woman who goes out with a guy and has a couple of beers very quickly ascertains that there's got to be something different about male metabolic processing, because how come he can drink a six-pack before he feels whoopee, and I've only had one beer or maybe one glass of wine and I'm already lightheaded? And that's a kind of simple example that even human males and human females metabolize differently, react to substances differently. So if you want to introduce a whole different species, now we're really playing with chance, not science. So for example, when it comes to toxicity testing, in many cases, the results in terms of predicting what will happen in a human are really no better than if you flipped a coin to try to decide, is that toxic, is it not, will it inflame, will it not? Because animals respond so differently. They're not needed in biomedical research. We did a series of papers showing how not only did they not help us, but in many ways they gave us erroneous information about human health. And why is that? Well, we commissioned a geneticist to take a look at what is the difference between a human and a chimpanzee on a genetic level, because it's only 1 or 2 points, 1 or 2 percentage points. In other words, you and I are closer to a chimp genetically than a chimp is to a gorilla or an orangutan. And what he found was that it's around gene expression, and the major area of that is in immune functioning. So how can I test something on an animal, on a species, that has such a different immune function than I do? Europe is way ahead of us in terms of understanding the importance of blending science and ethics to make for the kind of change that not only progresses science, but really benefits human health and well-being. Not to mention is humane and ends tremendous animal suffering. So the European Union has, of course, made significant changes, not just in cosmetic testing, but they were the first to essentially end the use of chimpanzees in biomedical research. But Americans really will accept the use of animals in testing and research under 2 conditions: that it's necessary and that they don't suffer. Given science today, it's not necessary and they do suffer. So the more the American public has become aware of that, and part of that is to the credit of the animal protection movement, exposing some of the realities of what does it mean exactly to be a rabbit used in skin irritancy testing. If you ask somebody, how does a rabbit sound? And they usually go silent, because a rabbit is basically a pretty silent animal. It's part of how they survive, right? They don't make a lot of noise. But a rabbit in a lab, a rabbit in a testing, toxicity, irritancy, stereotaxic device screams. They can scream. They're always terrified. They're always having to be restrained. When people started to see the reality of what cosmetic testing on animals really looked like, they started to rapidly reject it and saw it as the one area that absolutely could not justify animal use, suffering, and death. Because we do have to remember that the end point is almost always death. So the American public, there's polls now that show, polls as recent as 2013, 2015, that show the very high percent of Americans who are opposed to the use of animals in cosmetic testing. In fact, in one poll, it's the only area that we've seen a decrease in acceptance. and it's in terms of socially conscious issues, and it's a full 18% change from the last interview. So right now, if we were to put it to the American public to vote on, we would win, we would prevail, because the majority of Americans are not in favor of animal testing. And the reason? Because they suffer, and because we're educating the American public, they feel the results are not as safe for them as it will be with some of the new modern technologies, methods, and approaches. If you're claiming your product is safe, that's the most substantial claim that any product has to make. It's safe. It's safe, and then the second one is, and it's beneficial. And if we're using an animal model that doesn't necessarily predict what will happen in a human, then right there, your claims are on a little bit of kind of shaky ground. They're on shaky ground. And yet, pharmaceutical companies, cosmetic companies have had to use an animal model to establish what FDA calls efficacy. Does it work? And safety. And is it safe? So that very basic claim of safety, we're going to see as companies continue, because they are moving toward non-animal alternatives. I was talking to a chemist here today who, when he found out where I was from, he said, oh God, when I first got out of school, I worked in a lab. He said, I couldn't stand what was going on with the animals. I quit. And he said, and what I have a hard time with now is how unsophisticated the science is behind using animals, how erroneous it is, how limited it is, how, he's a biochemist as well. It just doesn't predict what's going to happen in a reliable, consistent way. So the first product claim, and the American public agrees with me on this one, they trust products that haven't been tested on animals at a higher percentage rate than they trust products that have been tested on animals. So that's a huge shift, not just in attitude, but in basic understanding of good science. The animal model is being replaced by better science. Harvard University is one of the ones leading the charge. We supported a MD toxicologist, a Dr. Björn Ekvall from Sweden, who's one of the first to develop an in vitro non-animal, in vitro meaning in glass or in a test tube, an in vitro non-animal model to test toxicity. And that was a good 30 years ago, 20, 25 years ago that he started. Now we're seeing alternatives sort of developing at an ever-accelerating rate. So one would say, well, then why isn't it all replacing animals right now? Well, because of bureaucracy, and because they need to be validated, and they need to be accepted. And the funny thing about that is the animal tests that they're replacing were never validated. So we have that kind of social conundrum where status quo is really delaying. It's creating a kind of scientific jet lag. Again, because we're 120 years old, and because I've seen change all the way from the first vet school ending its terminal lab where beagles are brought in, practiced on, and then killed at the end of the day, to changes in the LD50, which is lethal dose 50, where 50% of the animals have to die from increasing doses, to in vitro tests that have a higher prediction of human toxicity. Because I've seen all these changes, I'm always optimistic. However, it's always felt much more painfully slow than it should be for ethical and human health reasons. And I think what we're going to start to see is, like all social conscious movement, we're going to see a sudden sort of acceleration of change. And I think the two pivotal points around which the use of animals in science, in research and testing, will have been the chimpanzee, because if we don't need them, and they're so genetically similar to us, and they haven't proved helpful with HIV, and they were never really used in cancer research, and they're not really used in heart research because they get a whole different kind of heart disease, and on and on and on. And cosmetic testing, where the largest number of animals suffer and die. I think with those two posts to this kind of tent that we're building. I think we're going to see ever accelerating rates of change in replacing bad, inhumane science with better and more scientifically valid science. So it's going to happen. I don't know if it'll happen in my lifetime because I'm 66, but my mom had good genes. She died at 92. So I might just get to see not just cosmetic testing ending and chimpanzee research ending and terminal dog labs ending, but I might get to see that kind of acceleration of progress. To take that one step further, there's an old adage that says, change happens one funeral at a time. And I think in terms of the administrative, regulatory, government contributors to these decisions, I think we're going to see that change as new people, new scientists, new regulators come in. And it's going to happen. It's going to, because it has to. And everything's lining up to create an argument that's indefeatable.